Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar entitled Black Men with Firearm-Acquired Disabilities, Negotiating and Renegotiating Identities and Navigating Spaces. We are very excited to be hosting this very important conversation today, and thank you all for joining us as part of it. Just a few housekeeping tips. If you have any questions for our panelists during the conversation, please drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will work those in. There will also be some resources that are posted in the chat throughout the conversation. And if you need to step out for any reason, this is being recorded, so there will be a playback later on that we will also share out by email. So I first want to again welcome all of our panelists and thank you for joining us, and also introduce everybody to our audience. Nazsa Baker is the new research director and program manager of the Wraparound project at the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital in the Department of Surgery at the University of California at San Francisco. Her research focuses on community violence with an emphasis on firearm violence survivorship among Black men and hospital-based and hospital-linked violence intervention programs. Christopher St. Ville is an associate professor at the State University of New York's University at Buffalo, which he is repping for us today, in the School of Social Work. His work lies at the intersection of masculinity and victims of violent injury with a focus on trauma recidivism. Dr. St. Ville's work is rooted both within the hospital and community settings, and he has contributed to understanding research conducted with victims of violent injury and men and boys in general, specifically in the areas of recruitment, protocol development, and study design. And finally, Hashim Garrett is a renowned motivational speaker and consultant with over 2 decades of experience in resiliency training, social and emotional learning, and conflict resolution through forgiveness. In 2001, he founded Wisdom and Understanding, LLC, offering trauma-sensitive workshops designed to help individuals and organizations develop personal and professional growth strategies. His work has made him a sought-after collaborator with education boards, nonprofits, and enforcement agencies, including Breaking the Cycle of Violence, the Violence Prevention Institute, and the New Jersey Attorney General's Office. Thank you each for joining us today and sharing your insights and expertise on this topic with me, as well as our audience. Nazsa, I want to start with you. What brings us here today? That is, why is this such an important topic that we should be discussing?
So good afternoon, everyone. Well, in Pacific time, it's still the morning here, so good morning as well. So what brings us here today is little is known about how Black men experience disability once it's acquired via a firearm, and also we don't understand their coping mechanisms when they're experiencing their permanent or sometimes even temporary disability as a result of violence. And there's a significant lack of research on Black men with disabilities in general, but again, amongst this small subpopulation where, again, particularly those that have acquired their disabilities through firearm-related incidents. We tend to focus on the mental health piece and somewhat of the recovery piece, but we do not understand what life is like post-discharge, post-injury when someone acquires a firearm disability.
Thank you for providing that bit of an overview. Hashim, I understand that you're an individual with lived experience on this particular topic that we're here today to discuss. Can you tell us a little bit about how you were impacted and how that experience has shaped you?
Sure. So for me, I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and when I was 15, probably like a week before I was supposed to actually be relocated to another part of the country, I was shot multiple times, and as a result of that shooting, I sustained a spinal cord injury. Um, and so of course, a spinal cord injury is such a catastrophic injury, but unfortunately, most people have no idea the true ramifications that somebody's body undergoes when a bullet strikes your central nervous system, right? So from the outside looking in, people just see the wheelchair, but they don't realize the skin breakdowns that come with it from constantly sitting for hours and hours and not realizing that you need to like shift your weight, and then your muscles begin to atrophy, and you can't, your bowel and bladder are affected. And so So again, this happened to me when I was 15, and as a result of that shooting, life hasn't been the same, but I've learned to really be resilient and to kind of figure out how to move on and have the mental flexibility to realize that although my legs are impacted cognitively, there's still so much more that I can accomplish, you know?
Yeah, and you actually have shared your story with, groups around the country, right? You're turning your what many people could see as a negative into something positive and helping people grow. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about the work that you're doing, trying to help educate people about, what you go through and what others go through who have shared similar experiences?
Certainly. So it started for me back in the 90s, and violence was a really big thing. Like, so I'll give you a little data. In 1990 is when I was shot, which is like many, 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 many years ago. But it literally in New York City at the time, it was the most violent year on record in the state of New York. And so from 1990, I sustained my injury. 1995, I began to go out and do lectures and talk to students. And initially, it was really kind of just sharing what happened to me, right? That was the hook. And students wanted to know, like, okay, I see you sitting in front of me in my classroom, and you're in a wheelchair. And so the hook was, let me tell you my story. How did this happen? What that night was like? What was the experience like of me standing on a corner and a kid walking up to me and shooting me multiple times, and then he runs off and I'm laying there and I can't move and everything changes in a blink of an eye. And I begin to share with students what those seconds were like when I realized, wait a minute, I can't feel my legs. And why can't I? Because a second ago I could, but now I can't. And explaining to them the processes that everything that I was going through, and just kind of like calling out to God and saying, God, help me. And that transformative moment, just feeling this peace. But it didn't stop there. And then I began to explain to students, like, well, okay, now I'm kind of settled and saying, all right, something is wrong, but I'm not as afraid. And now I'm waiting for the police to arrive, and what that 15 to 20 minutes feels like, when everybody runs off and I'm laying there by myself and I'm in and out of consciousness. And now the police arrive, and the police are telling everybody back up, and they're putting a caution tape out. Like, I want to I want them to live vicariously through me, to really understand, like, the music doesn't show this side, the video games doesn't show this side, the movies don't show this side. So let me try to paint as a vivid picture as possible. And so, I explain to them what those moments are like when the police are coming, and then explain to them what it feels like when the EMS workers are picking you up and putting you on a stretcher and stabilizing your neck, and they're putting you into the back of the ambulance, explaining what all of this looks like and what it feels like. And so what happened is in 1995, I'm going out and I'm talking to students about that experience. And so it was a physician out in Harvard who really looked at violence and said, this is truly a health epidemic. And so she created an acquaintance, adolescence acquaintance violence prevention program. And long story short, I started going out to the schools and talking to students about how to resolve conflicts, because you've got a captivated audience of kids in schools, and every day they're learning math and science and social studies, and they learning those core subjects, which is great. But how do we infuse things that are happening in real time, right? Kids are going back home in neighborhoods that are drug infested and crime and poverty. And how do we make sure that they can navigate that and not get hurt or hurt someone else? So what we figured out was talk to students during their health classes, because violence is a health epidemic. We're not taking away instructional time. And it was 4 days of every day you talk about one topic that leads into another. And so I did that for many years, talking to students about conflict resolution and what causes gun violence. So for an example, homicide is the #1 cause of death for young African-American kids between the ages of 15 and 24. But what causes homicides? What are the precipitating factors that lead up to it? And it is firearms. It is, it's arguments. It's the alcohol and drugs. So if you mix these three things together, someone is arguing, that person has a weapon, and they're drunk or under the influence, that is a recipe for violence, right? And so this is what I began to do, is really explain to them. And so you tell them about those three things: arguments, alcohol, and weapons. But then at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you have a conversation about learning how to control your temper. Because if you can't control your temper, you're going to argue about a lot of things. Not everyone who kills or shoots or injures is always under the influence. It literally just might be a 2-second argument. What are you looking at? That was my parking space. You talking to my girl. I don't know what the argument is about, but arguments lead to more conflicts and fights. And so that's the message, is to make sure that students know how to resolve arguments, how to control their tempers. And so I did that for a long time. And then I started, reaching out. Some other people reached out and said, but I think forgiveness is something that's really, really important. And so I'm going to segue and turn the mic back over to you. But forgiveness was something that I really learned what was so essential, what was missing, and learning how to repair the harm, right? And just saying, I'm going to forgive you, not for you, but for me, because my life and my future and my health is way too important to jeopardize it for whatever we're arguing about. Like, I want to go back home. I want to go back to class. I want to do something, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to hurt you and I don't want to get hurt. And so that's the forgiveness. I'm forgiving you for me. And that's a part of the resilience, which is the next topic in talking to students. Like, look, I got shot when I was a kid, but how did I make it? How did I make it from that kid to the grown man that you see in front of you? And then we begin to have conversations about understanding that it's so important to talk. It's so important to seek help, whether that comes in the form of a grandparent, a parent, a coach, a therapist, a clergy, but talking. You have to talk, but then you have to be careful of who you talk to, because you don't want to pick up, negative ways on how to cope with life. Everybody has their own coping strategies, but if you talk to the wrong people, you're going to get the wrong advice, right? Because smoking and drinking and escaping is not going to help you deal with whatever issue you're dealing with. So I'll turn the floor back over.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of complexities. And I think that that's sort of one of the underlying conversations that we've had, leading up to this webinar. Nazsa, what is, what Hashim's sharing with us, how is that mirroring what we're seeing in the research? And I know that that's a challenge to answer, right? Because there's also not a lot of research, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so there are significant gaps in understanding the unique needs of this population and also the services post-hospital discharge, whether it be physical therapy, occupational therapy. We don't know what's currently available to those who, are deemed disabled because of their injuries. But again, like in terms of Hashim's experience, Jaclyn talks about the ability to manage life post-injury presents a series of challenges with activities of daily living. So showering and bathing, getting in and out of bed, getting dressed, right? Maintaining employment, also being able to manage pain. But I think when we talk about this intersection of manhood and masculinities, what we forget is the ability to have sex, right? Or want to have sex, or want to have, romantic partners that, will not see you as disabled, right? But then when we talk about Hashim's experience, what does this look like for teenage Black boys and even Latinx boys, right? Growing into their manhood with their firearm-acquired disabilities. Do they have the same outlook on like when they move from being what is perceived as able-bodied to, semi-able to possibly non-able, right? Depending on the severity of their injury.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And Chris, I want to bring you in because I know that, looking at the intersection of masculinity and manhood, especially as it relates to gun violence, is an area that you specialize in. What are your thoughts as you're hearing Hashim tell his story?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, when we think about like the expression of identity in general, it's like partly rooted in like a physical performance, right? So like doing things enables us to express ourselves as we see it. We present ourselves to the world, walking, standing, playing, even sitting, right? You could do it in a particular sort of way, a particular sort of swag that sort of reflects what your identity is. So this expression of identity is sort of like rooted in the idea that like gender is not being that something one is, but rather something that one does, right? So it's rooted in activity and rooted in action. So then the body allows us to fulfill roles such as worker, partner, parent, you know, these roles that really contribute to our sense of self. So when we experience, or when someone experiences a change to their bodily, you know, to the state of their body, they experience changes to their ability to perform those routine and daily functions that may have contributed to their sense of identity. So then there's a gap there. And because of that gap and not being able to fulfill the roles that contributed to my identity, then you begin to experience stress, anger, depression, all sorts of things, right? So to be physical, so basically to be physical is, you know, basically to be yourself. In US society in general, when we're thinking about masculinity, right? In the US, we have a certain ideal of what a man should be. There's a certain ideal. And oftentimes in the US, oftentimes it's connected to physicality, right? So all men don't basically measure their masculinity by physicality, but many do, right? So we think about so many young boys that want to be football players, or we think about men who think about the dirty work that men do. Physicality is really connected to masculinity in the US. So when the man is unable to fulfill those roles that society says are masculine as a result of his limited functioning, then of course that leads to all sorts of a rabbit hole of depression and, you know, self-blame and pity and shame, you know, unless we're able to get him out of that rabbit hole and he has the support that he has to be able to deal with those modifications and those adjustments.
So one thing I'm kind of picking up that you guys have all, you know, indirectly touched upon, although Chris, I think you actually did it a lot more directly, is this idea of help-seeking behavior, right? And we know that there are stigmas around help-seeking behavior, kind of, you know, intersecting in two different ways, right? There is, it's a very different experience for individuals who are white compared to Black when it comes to help-seeking, and then also for men compared to women. And so how do, you know, sort of this double intersection, if you will, how is it, you know, from a, you know, when we think about all of the different resources, right, that individuals will need, you need physical support when you have a firearm acquired disability, you need mental support, social support, financial support. How might those challenges that each group inherently faces potentially be barriers to seeking out those supports? How do they overcome them?
Well, that's where basically kind of understanding their social location matters, right? So everyone's disability is not going to be the same, right? Some disabilities, some people are still walking. Other disabilities, people are not walking. Some may have use of their arms or their hands, right? Some disabilities may be cognitive, right? As Hashim mentioned. So understanding the social location of that disability and understanding that social location within the intersection of the disability, socioeconomic status, the type of support that they have within their life, whether they have family and friends, someone who's consistent, even looking at their community and looking at whether or not their community has resources that they're able to get to on a local level. So taking stock of their social location and then starting from their social location, then kind of determining where they would want to go. You know what I'm saying? So putting the onus on them, empowering them to make their decision to kind of decide where they want to take this next, how they want to deal with their disability, how they want to move on in life with the disability, and then supporting them in that, but also doing that, but supporting them in a way where they are empowering themselves, right? And getting over some of these stigmas that they may have for themselves as a result of what society says about people with disabilities, right? And working with them on really overcoming some of the limitations that they may feel that they have, and getting over and also getting over a lot of the emotional stuff that they're going to be experiencing. As you said, there's going to be a lot of emotions that come with this, but then them being able to function how they want, right? It's just going to help add to that empowerment and then hopefully dissipate that depression that they may be experiencing. Hashim may have more to say, add to that.
I was
Actually,
actually going to throw it to him next. Hashim, what are your thoughts on this? How did support manifest itself in your life after the shooting?
Well, it definitely started, the support started with family first. My parents were extremely supportive and still are. And so that was instrumental in helping me kind of put the pieces back together. And then it transformed into, or morphed more into like, okay, I know I have mom and dad, and then cousins, they stepped up to the plate, and then friends. But if I had to be like really specific, um, it was the interaction with a female, like my first girlfriend after the injury, right? And that helped to kind of what mom and dad could not fill the roles that she could, and friends and cousins could not fill the role that a significant other could, right? And so that helped to complement me and help me to feel whole again, right? And so, but one of the things I realized was, okay, I guess maybe it's you want your cake and eat it too. So you're like, okay, well, if I could get her, let me see if I can take this and take the show on the road. And so now I go off to college and I'm on campus and I'm like, oh, I'm still that guy, And so it was like the girls were the things that really empowered me to say, yeah, you might need to, your ability and your mobility might look different, but as long as you have that confidence, as long as you still have humor, as long as you still have that je ne sais quoi, that thing that was in you, don't let that die, right? Just because your legs are not working, like, okay, literally, I look at it, it's all about perspective. Dr. Stephen Covey, author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, there's a quote that stuck with me, the way you see the problem can be the problem, right? And so, like, if I look at my ability not to walk and I say, yo, this is like a broken leg, I can't walk right now. And when you shift your mind and the perspective, it changes everything. And so again, having the support of family was instrumental, friends instrumental, but the having a female in my life definitely was extremely helpful. But one of the things I realized also about perspective is that my masculinity was really more tied into, once getting a girl got that checklist. Now it was about saying, but you need resources. I need to be able to, I have this girl, but I need to take her out. We can't just sit in the house and watch TV all day. That means I need a car. That means I need a job. That she wants to go eat. I got it. Like, she wants to eat. I want to eat. Like, you have to go. And so that was what I found, like, okay, my manhood is aligned and connected with my money and my wealth. And that, honestly, I found over the years is extremely harmful, because at any given time, you could lose your earning potential. And now so this is one of the things we look at with men, right? We are defined. Well, I'll put disability to the side because I'm a man first before I'm a person living with a disability, right? So I am defined as a man as a provider, right? And so if I can't provide, then who am I? Right. And I am looked at as a man if I have a wife and kids and an earner. But if my wife leaves me and I can't see the kids and I don't have a job, like, now I feel less than. Right. And so that's something that I've come to learn, that we should not be defined by these type of things, because they can go, and they probably will at some point. Because one of the things about disabilities, my disability I acquired as a result of a firearm. But if you live long enough, we will all be disabled at some point, at some point, right? You live long enough, something is going to happen. You're not going to move as quickly as you did. And so, it's just a matter of shifting that perspective, and not feeling like your manhood is tied to ... You have to know yourself first. You have to value yourself first, right? And because when the money goes, I'm still a man. If the lady in your life goes, I'm still like, who are you? And so that's one of the things that I'm just kind of learning in life. Sure, friends are gonna be there and support you, and females and all of that, but you have to know who you are. You have to know your worth. And so that's something that I've learned along in life.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do just want to remind our audience, please feel free to drop any questions that you have for our panelists throughout this conversation into the Q&A at the bottom. Nazsa, I know that you've done some research with firearm violence survivors, particularly with Black men. How are the themes that we're hearing in this conversation mirroring the broader research that you're doing and what we know about, survivorship in general?
So I think Hashim really hit the nail on the head when he talks about trying to understand himself in terms of right mobility, like physical mobility. But I think the main thing here is this concept of Black manhood and masculinities, and how Black men tie their manhood and masculinities to heteropatriarchy, right? So falling under the category of what society, white society and institutions tell them that they have to be, right? They have to be the protector physically, right? They have to be the provider financially. So really assuming these roles that are bestowed upon them once, someone gives birth to a boy, right? So this is an expectation that Black boys have at a very early age, where they're adultified, from a young age, where if they're in a single home with a mom, they're becoming a man earlier, right? They're jumping off the porch, they're getting into the underground economy, going out and getting jobs to be able to provide for their household, right? So they're winging this concept of what it means to be a man at a very early age, excuse me, and morphing into actual manhood over the age of 26, believing these same ideologies that they have to put themselves into these boxes, even if they're shot, right? Even if they become disabled, right? As Hashim is saying, right? He is like, hey, I thought, right, having this romantic partner, right, that intertwines with my manhood, being able to get the money, right, even to take her out, again, intertwines with his manhood. A lot of these things, it's very complex, it's very, very layered, and this is, again, a part of research that no one knows about. No one is trying to understand, to my knowledge, that what happens, right? We know that not everybody that gets shot dies, but what happens when Black men become temporarily and or permanently disabled due to their firearm injuries, right? What does that recovery process look like? Because if you're permanently disabled, that's long term. We don't know the long-term health outcomes, the social outcomes, the environmental outcomes, any of these implications for this particular population.
I meant to ask you this a little bit earlier. What is the prevalence of Black men who are experiencing firearm-acquired disabilities? Do we even know what that looks like in terms of context, Nazsa?
No, we have no idea. I haven't seen anybody try to quantify it. We don't know how hospitals are capturing this type of data. We we don't know. We don't know the incidence. We don't know the prevalence. And that's something that I have put myself on a mission to do, even as a qualitative scholar, is to really understand what the numbers are. So we have the NVDRS system. However, it tells us who died, who didn't die, but it also doesn't tell us, it doesn't go in depth, who has become temporarily disabled and who is deemed permanently disabled due to their injuries.
We actually have an audience question I'd like to interject. Apparently, Nazsa, from your former student. Hashim talks about arguments and other factors that can lead to gun violence. If there were communication classes taught in schools like K to 12 at a young age, do you think that this would decrease the incidence of gun violence in local communities? So we'll start with that one. And anybody feel free to jump in on that.
Well, I mean,
Well,
well, go ahead, Hashim, you got
no,
it.
no, I'll let you jump in first. I'll
So I
tackle
was
it
gonna
after you.
say, communication training is just one, sort of training. It's not a panacea, because we got to think about it. I mean, I think there's an overall adage, a general like sense of belief that all young Black men who get involved in gun violence, like, they do so because of nefarious reasons, and that's not the case, right? Like, so while there may be some things that happen as a result of arguments and stuff, arguments are just one factor that play into it. There are plenty of young men who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are plenty of young men who get hit by stray bullets. So actually that's something that we need to look at actually in the research is, this idea of men who come to the trauma unit as a result of a firearm injury. Are they all, they tend to be, people tend to stereotype them like, oh, you're from the streets, or you selling drugs. But is that really the case? And there needs to be more research done on these events that precipitate, violent firearm injury. And all of these young men are not engaged in nefarious activity or are arguing all the time. So communication can be something that we do incorporate into different interventions, but it's not the panacea.
And, one thing I'm picking up, Chris, that you're talking a lot about is that social stigma, right? And how, and we have to think about how that social stigma on top of everything else is potentially acting as a barrier to seeking out services or receiving services that may already be in existence. Hashim, you were going to add something as well to that question from our audience.
Yeah, I personally think that, communication about conflict resolution is important, but it's literally just one of the tools that are needed in order to kind of reduce the amount of gun violence that we see. I think the other components, like we've seen over the years, right, all of the character education, the conversations about bullying prevention, conflict resolution being another part of it. Now it's the social emotional learning, so I think what we really have to examine for the K to 12 population is implementing the coping strategies, right? Because one of the things that I've learned over the years doing this so long, homicide was super prevalent years ago in the Black and brown communities. But now suicide is just, it's at the top of the list right there with homicides, right? And so more Black and brown kids are committing and attempting suicide at an alarming rate, right? And so I think it's important, as gun violence is still a major issues. I think what we're realizing now as a society is that the mental component is something that we can't skirt around, because if, again, that's why I kind of touched on the anger component, learning how to control your temper, right? Controlling yourself is being able to realize, like, okay, it's bigger than the argument, right? It's something else brewing in me. It's about that forgiveness. There's something else brewing in me, right? And this is why we see, like, and I know you, Jaclyn, you talked about like school shootings, mass shootings before, right? There's something else happening, right? And it's really more pervasive than just conflicts. Something is happening internally. So I think, there has to be like a whole revamp of how we are educating young kids in that K to 12 spaces.
Yeah. And then just to add to that, we need to do that. We need to focus on those efforts where we help, people in these communities develop the coping skills and stuff like that. But also, we just focusing on them puts a lot of the blame on in the agency on just them, right? Like, there are other characteristics in these communities where these shootings take place that are structural as well, right? So while we focus on changing, coping mechanisms and how folks deal, on a personal level, on a structural level, we know research shows that, where places that have high rates of gun violence, they tend to be dark places in terms of like, they're not the nicest places, right? They don't have adequate sidewalks, right? They don't have adequate lighting, you know what I mean? They don't have any healthcare facilities within a reasonable distance, food deserts, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's going on structurally that's contributing to, like Hashim said, to both homicide in Black communities and suicide in white rural communities. You know what I mean? And looking at the structural aspect around how that can alleviate a lot of pressures that lead people to view firearms as an option, whether it be homicide or suicide, or go a long way.
We actually received another question from the audience. Can you guys talk about, and I'm going to kind of throw this out because I think all of your perspectives, while different, would really be interesting on this question. Can you talk about the systemic conditions that lead people to engage in gun violence, especially since this epidemic is more prevalent in the US? And I'd like to also ask that question and add on to it in the context of the experiences that Black and Brown communities are having across the nation, right? Because gun violence for those communities look very different than, let's say, white communities. So what are the systemic factors that are really contributing to this public health epidemic?
So I'll just jump in really quickly. I think when you analyze like the systematic targeting of Black and Brown children via music, via social media, like this is very intentional about what can be disseminated across these airwaves around these platforms. You know, for an example, there's a lot of music now, right? Drill music. And a lot of this music, it's, you know, it's very, very toxic, where young kids, you know, they literally are saying things about, I'm gonna kill you and this one died. And so it's easy for most people to just say, well, look at those kids, like they look at how they talk to each other. But the reality is, but there are algorithms that are set up in place that if they said any other word about any other group, those channels would be blocked. But as long as they continue to push the narrative about killing one another for whatever reason, it will continue to just there's no stopping it. And so kids don't realize that they're pawns, you know, they're being used to like they don't realize killing each other is profitable for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who profit from young Black and Brown kids getting killed and getting incarcerated, you know, sustaining spinal cord injuries. Like there are a lot of people who benefit from this, right? And I mean on a macro and a micro level, right? And so, but again, they don't realize it. And the reality is, and I'll kind of touch on what, you know, Brother Chris mentioned earlier about, you know, just some of these environments, like you can go from one community to another, and you know when you stepped out of an inner city community versus a suburban community. What's one of the biggest things you'll see? Suburban communities have tree-lined blocks, and another section has no trees. Like just the atmosphere changes, right? And so little things like that. It's the, you know, the broken window policy. Like you see the prostitution, you see it. And so if a child sees it, then that means law enforcement sees it. And this is not to bash police officers, because literally they are at the bottom of the pole of the criminal justice system. They cannot change laws. They don't make policies. They are literally, you know, they are there to enforce and do what they're told to do, but they don't change. They're not the reason why the community looks the way that it does. So I think, you know, to answer the question, it's the music, you know, it is the social media platforms. And again, just from top down, there's a reason why certain schools look the way they do, and there's a reason why communities look the way they do. And the reality is these children who are 14 and 15-year-olds, they didn't create all of this. They're literally just being born into this.
I think
No.
too, from a macro perspective, like taking it a step back, just historically, right? And also contemporarily, forms of structural racism. If we look at concentrated poverty, if we look at racial segregation and racialized economic extraction, those type of things tend to shape the distribution of gun violence around the US, and also heavily impact the way in which impact the lives of Black men who survive their injuries as well.
And then when we think about these communities, right, you know, you know, when we think about these communities, a lot of these communities that experience gun violence have underfunded public services, right? So this is where the worst schools are. Once again, the food deserts, right? No real resources really for families to have. Then we have the easy access to firearms. It's not like these kids, you know, it's not like the guns in these communities is legal. You know what I mean? So the access to being able to have access to these illegal firearms to these young people, that's another issue, right? And then when we think about, you know, when we think about, okay, yes, firearms and homicide definitely affects the Black community more so than it does other communities, no question. But when we think about the cultural factor, right, you know, this statistic doesn't mean that, oh, Black people, you know, are exclusively like this, you know, it have an issue with guns. No, homicide, yeah, no question. But in terms of the culture of the normalization of guns and gun ownership in this country, that is an American issue. That is not just a Black issue. So dealing with the normalization of gun violence and just guns in general, right? Like, we guns can't we have kind of like normalized it in popular culture, right? Guns, you know, are used for hunting. They're used for target practice, sharpshooting. You know, there's people should be able to have access to firearms in whatever hobby that they like. But what we do need to stay away from is this normalization of this culture of guns as, like, you know, as this weapon of, like, this normalization of that, in that sense of it, I think is something that we could work on. So cultural factors, easy access to firearms, and underfunded public services, I think, are some structural aspects that we can kind of dip in on that might be able to do something.
But I
Right.
also I just could chime in for 30 seconds on that. I
Go
do
ahead.
think as a survivor of gun violence, honestly, I look at around the world and I say, why is it that America, you know, is still holding on to this Constitution of the right to bear arms? Because the Constitution written over 200 years ago, and the arms that they talked about were not the same guns that exist today. They look completely different. Like, we have to do something about changing this Constitution that says every person should have a right to bear arms. We shouldn't. You know, we have to do something. And I think maybe it's just me, but I look at it and go, I think it's a very, you know, insidious thing to see all of the issues that are happening in this country and still continue to say, no, but I think it's okay for us to bear arms. And the statistics show that if a person owns a firearm, it's a lot more likely that somebody in their house is going to die as a result of the firearm that they own. You know, so this idea of, you know, I want to have a gun for hunting. Most people don't hunt, you know, and I'm just talking about in communities that I know, right? In urban environments, they're not hunting, right? And so you got people who have guns, and you have to be concerned. Is your domestic partner going to kill you? Is somebody going to commit suicide with a gun? Is a child going to find a gun in a home? And then we still hold on to this idea, but what if somebody breaks into my home and, you know, and I need to use the firearm? Like, that doesn't happen nearly as much as the other things. But I often wonder, is it because the country was built on racism and slavery that somehow that we want to continue to keep this narrative going that guns should be okay? Because look, if we remove the guns, then I mean, Black people can't kill each other, you know? And so when you have other countries that are very homogenized, they don't have that. Japan doesn't have it. And, you know, other countries where everybody looks the same and people care about the prime minister looks like the peasant, we're going to go, nah, I'm not going to allow that to happen. But in our country, it's not the same. So I wonder if racism is playing a major role in why this continues to perpetuate itself.
Well, and I think to kind of summarize the points that you all made, right? We also know that our country, in addition to a very high prevalence of firearms, also has a very deep-rooted historical culture of violence. And that's effectively what this country was founded on. You know, certainly we have made strides in the many years with things like safe storage laws and policies, you know, domestic violence protection orders, when enforced, extreme risk protection orders, and other policies that get at some of these. But of course, we also know that we still have a long way to go. I want to kind of come back to another question that was asked by our original audience member who posted a question. And he asked, you know, and I'm going to kind of pose this to Chris and to Hashim. In your instance, Hashim, you have experienced a permanent disability. And I know that Nazsa, you also mentioned sometimes individuals suffer a temporary disability acquired from a firearm. Do hospitals utilize social workers to come out to gun violence victims at their homes and help follow up with progression? Are they able to help people find resources? Hashim, did you have any experiences like that where a social worker in the hospital was able to help you navigate the aftermath of your acquired disability?
No, that wasn't my experience, but I'm actually a social work intern at the moment. And so one thing I will say is that because, for an example, my length of stay as an inpatient was 6 months, right? And so a person with the same level of injury that I have now, I was in a hospital for 6 months, but now in 2024, someone will probably be in a hospital for, and that this is with the trauma and, you know, the rehabilitative hospital, they might be in hospital for 4 weeks, right? The length of stay is extremely, extremely short now, and that's more for insurance purposes. So, you know, the resources that one can get are so limited now because they don't have access to social workers, but for a few weeks. But one of the things I definitely want to say before I forget is that when it comes to, for an example, my spinal cord injury, there's an old saying that spinal cord injuries are like snowflakes. No two are exactly the same. And if you've ever, you know, seen a football player or anyone who's sustained a spinal cord injury and they are what we call a tetraplegia or a quadriplegia, meaning they cannot move their four extremities, their arms or their legs, and they have to, you know, some may need a ventilator to breathe, right? So these injuries are catastrophic, and so I just want to make sure that I emphasize, like, the range of what a disability looks like is so vast, right? But as a person of color, as a Black man with a spinal cord injury, I can say being Black in this country is difficult, but when you are Black with a physical disability, now I'm not going to say cognitive, I'm just talking about physical disabilities, it is extremely, extremely arduous. And can you imagine if a person is of color and they have a criminal record and they have a disability? That's literally like, you know, you are so far down on a totem pole of resources that you are eligible for, right? And so I think that's always important to acknowledge as well, the difficulties that one has to traverse when they have all of these things against them.
Yeah, and then Hashim's point of being so low down that totem pole speaks about that social location, right? When you're working with these folks, like, what is their social location? Where they at on that totem pole? And then we begin to look around for the resources. But with regard to the support, you know, there are programs around the country in different cities around the country called hospital-based violence intervention programs. These are programs that are staffed by surgeons, nurses, and social workers, and at times some public health practitioners, where they will approach young victims who experienced a violent injury, whether it be a gunshot wound, stabbing, or assault, and they will approach that victim at bedside with the hopes of engaging them in the uptake of services. And those services are designed to help prevent them from experiencing a subsequent re-injury. So the services start in the hospital with approaching the victim at the bedside, the survivor at the bedside, and then linking that survivor with community-based services that they may then engage, that may then help them engage in other activities that would reduce the likelihood of them experiencing a subsequent re-injury, or reduce the likelihood of them engaging in the activities that led to them being injured in the first place. So those are so there's one, actually that's where Dr. Baker and I actually met. She worked at one in New Jersey over at Rutgers. I'm currently working with one over here in Buffalo, New York, and then they're all over the country, violence intervention programs. So yeah, so those are the programs when people experience injury. That's how we kind of try to bring them into the fray of services and try to get them to change. Well, that's if it was choices in life that led them there, right? Not everybody made a choice that led them there. Some there, wrong place, wrong time. You know what I mean? But for those that are seeking services, that's what those violence intervention programs are there for, to extend those services out so that they can do what they need to do to prevent another injury in the future. We don't want to see them again.
Can you give us a couple of examples of what these different resources that HVIPs use are that may be helpful in keeping people, you know, moving towards the positive?
So the programs vary in the level of resources that they have, because of course all programs differ in the level of funding that they have. But then so off top, they're definitely going to offer case management. They're going to offer resources at minimum, right? So at minimum, no, there's nothing there. We're going to at least talk to you and try to get you to change your worldview and your frame of mind. And then we're also going to connect you and refer you to resources. Those with resources can actually connect them with a credible messenger. Now, what's a credible messenger? A credible messenger is someone from the community, basically, who understands that whole context of where a lot of these victims come from and basically talks with them. A lot of times, credible messengers may themselves have experienced a violent injury and went through the program themselves, so they kind of serve as like a model of someone who went through the program, and they can explain the program to them. So a credible messenger is someone that they might be able to identify with, and then this person then ingratiates themselves and basically is able to, again, get them into the program. So with the best program, we'll have a credible messenger who can hand walk this guy to different referrals. They can help them with basically filling out paperwork around their injury. They can help them with victim services and help them apply for victim services paperwork. They can actually do home visits and visit them at home. They will help assist with setting up basically services around rehabilitation. You know what I mean? So there's a number. They will help around employment. Like if the guy wants to get help finding a job, they were unemployed, they'll help with that. So there's a plethora of services, and they vary depending on the resources that are available at that particular hospital-based violence intervention program.
And I
Thank you.
think
Sorry, go
to
ahead.
add on to that, I think what's important about these services is that they're culturally congruent services, right? Not culturally competent, but culturally congruent services where the survivor can align themselves potentially with what Chris was talking about, the credible messenger, to be able to at least apply for the resources and, most importantly, obtain the resources, either short-term or long-term.
And we did, just so that you guys know, we did actually get a comment from one of our audience members who's so grateful that you guys mentioned HVIPs, because they are actually from a program in Connecticut that offers or hosts an HVIP program, as well as other wraparound services to help gun violence survivors. So clearly what you guys are bringing up is something that's resonating throughout communities in the US. We have just a few more minutes, and so excuse my dog for a moment. So I would like to ask this as a kind of final question, and Chris, I'll start with you, then Nazsa, if you would like to jump in, and then Hashim, I would love for you to kind of bring us home. What sorts of things can people do to support men experiencing a disability from a firearm? Myself, community organizations, what can we do?
Well, for one, understand the intersectionality of disability and masculinity, and kind of get, once again, looking at the social location, kind of gauging where they are in terms of how they think about masculinity, how they're thinking about their injury, the actual injury, their socioeconomic status, their resources, their place. Taking all of that into consideration, that has to be taken into consideration so you can consider what approach you're going to even have. Once again, the person may not be high on masculinity, they may be low on masculinity, may not be an issue. But if they are high on masculinity, which in the US men tend to be, then you want to take that into consideration. Next, after you figure out their social location, then you want to basically begin on empowering them, right? Helping them understand that this is not the end of the world, that they are not their disability. Right? That their disability now is just one aspect of who they are, that there are so many other aspects of them that they are aware of, and there may be some aspects of them that they're not aware of that they'd be willing to explore. And how do we help them begin to not ground their identity in the disability, but to ground their identity in the things that they do, and these other things that make them not think about the disability. And then at the end of the day, really kind of helping them create this network of support. I think Hashim kind of pointed out, he had his family, he had cousins, then he had his old lady there. You know what I'm saying? Like, how do we help these individuals? So as a social worker, I'm not going to be able to be there for them all the time, right? At some point, he's gonna have to get off of my role, you know what I mean? And I'm gonna have to discharge them off of my role. But then who is gonna be there for him and helping him set up that network? Or can we connect them with a provider community? Can we figure out how to help them develop those relationships with their family, with their loved ones? And how do we help them create their network of support, so that when the workers leave, that you have this network? And how do we help them establish that? So I think that's the biggest thing, because we're not going to be there all the time if we're not the family member or the loved one. You know what I mean? So helping them develop that network and figuring out all of their options around that, because people tend to not think through all of their options when they tend to be angry and depressed and stuff like that?
For me first, when we think about this from a research lens, really genuinely and transparently centering the voices and lived experience, right, of these men, but also not just of the men, but like Chris said, those in their ecosystem, because they're also impacted as well. Their romantic partners, their mothers, their children, so primarily Black women. From a macro perspective, intentionally advocating for both policies and evidence-informed and based strategies to enhance support for this population. So we're thinking financial resources, employment opportunities, healthcare accessibility for this population. When we look at the ADA rules, it's not inclusive, right, of those that acquire firearm disabilities. It's not. We tend to think about, when we think of the ADA, those that are born with a disability and or acquired a disability from maybe like a car accident, maybe a fall, but not something where it's racially tied to seen as a way of life for this particular population. So being able to engage with policymakers and advocates to advocate for reform and most importantly, new legislation that prioritizes the safety and intentional well-being of this particular population. And I think on a community level, as researchers, as people in general, really using our power and our platforms to influence and raise awareness, which is what Hashim does, right, through his organization. And again, just being able to utilize different channels to disseminate that type of the message in terms of this particular population needs, they need resources, right? Beyond post-hospital discharge, beyond social workers. And I think lastly, being cognizant of our language. So one of the things that I do is I ask the men, like, do you consider yourself disabled? And I give them that autonomy to either reject or accept, right, that word. And I've had some of them tell me, no, I'm handicapable, right? So I'm not handicapped, I'm not impaired. I see myself as a regular person. I still do things like other men, I just do them differently, right? So again, just being cognizant of the language and how we talk to individuals within this subpopulation.
Thank you for that. And Hashim.
Yeah, definitely well said. They definitely touched on a lot of things that I was jotting down. But I will say, number one, just remember, not here for a pity party. Like I don't need your pity because your pity doesn't help pay my bills, right? So, but as far as resources are concerned and how we can help is, making sure that people with a disability have housing, making sure that people with a disability have, gainful employment, making sure a person with a disability, if they want to go back to school, helping them with those resources. It's really kind of like the social determinants of health. And so peer mentoring is such a key component in it as well, right? Because the old saying is your network increases your net worth. Your network increases your net worth. So if you're surrounding yourself with some people and they are, have that social capital where you can tap into people and they say, listen, I know somebody, who just got their home modified. Oh, wow, I didn't know. How did you go about doing that? Or, yeah, I just, I use this to get from point A to point B. Wow. Not only did I get my home modified, but my car modified. And sometimes, when anybody has gone through anything, whether it is cancer, whatever it is, peer support is instrumental. And peer support is not just for the man, the person living with it, but it's also for his caregivers, because his wife and his significant other, she needs to know she is not the only one, supporting someone who has a disability. So it is important for their union to so she knows that she's not by herself in this, right? So peer support and so all of the things that Nazsa and Chris mentioned, the resources, again, from the macro to the micro level, that's how you can be supportive. And just saying, listen, let's not forget about this particular population, because they are marginalized. They were marginalized before the injury, they were marginalized before the injury. So let's not forget that. And so I know DEI is not a topic that we really want to talk about now, 4 years post George Floyd. We're trying to shift the conversation now, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is still imperative. So yeah, I'll conclude with that.
Well, Naja said something of importance, which is that it's important to disseminate this information and this conversation. And so I want to thank the three of you for joining us today to engage in what is a very difficult topic that is not talked about enough, and for our audience members for coming here to learn more about this important topic and helping us move this conversation forward. As a reminder, if you would like, we will be posting this as a playback. So please keep an eye out for that on the Rockefeller Institute of Government's website. And we'll also share that information out via social media and our email blast once that is available. Naja, Chris, Hashim, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
likewise.